to Talks at Google. My name is Becky Thalman. I'm on the Mastery team at Google, focused on designing revolutionary learning experiences to enable GBO people leaders. I'm also a certified coach and founded Vivica Partners as a life and business strategy company. I'm so thrilled to be joined by Kindra Hall. She's president and chief storytelling officer at Stellar Collective, a consulting firm focused on strategic storytelling. She's a speaker and an author. Her Wall Street Journal bestselling book, Stories That Stick, was released in the fall of 2019, empowering company storytelling around their brand to current and potential customers. And her new book just came out last week, Choose Your Story, Change Your Life: How to Silence Your Inner Critic and Rewrite Your Life from the Inside Out. It'll help you take complete control of your inner stories and create the life you've always dreamed of. Welcome, Kindra.
Becky, thank you so much for having me. I'm so looking forward to this talk.
Me too. It's great to see you. And this book is such a gift at a time when we all need it here. We're in the middle of a lot, and you talk about the middle as messy and hard and confusing, and there's a lot of those dimensions happening. So this is an incredible opportunity that we all have here to join you today to hear more about what your book's about the concepts, how we can take more control and get in the driver's seat at a time when it feels a little confusing. So what wonderful timing.
Yeah. And I love, as you held up that book, Becky, that you had like Post-it notes in it. That's a sign of a good reader. That's
lots of writing, lots of highlighting.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, I think we are. This is such an interesting, and if I can be, I'll give you a little insider info. You know, we chose the publication date, 2022. And there was a point at which I thought to myself, you know, like at the beginning of 2021, I was like, you know what, this is terrible timing. We're all going to be in the roaring 20s. Everyone's going to be feeling so great and happy about that. They're not going to want to make their life better. It's already going to be so good. I kind of wish I had been right about that, but here we are. It's well timed, no matter where you are, no matter what's happening around you. And I think that's kind of the point.
Exactly. Yeah. We have only an hour, but a lot, I think, to talk about. And you and I had the opportunity to meet very quickly on Friday, but to set the intention we're here for all of you, all our viewers here, and to do really two things. One is to allow you to gain some self-awareness about some of the inner stories, the invisible inner stories that each of you have. We all have them, and start to identify what those are. And number two is really to come away with some of the strategies to rewrite your story. And although it's a fresh year of 2022, I think there's a lot that feels like in the middle that I noted earlier. So it's a great opportunity to do that. You and I are going to talk for about a half hour. I have so many questions about the book, and I want you to explain it and chat about that. You and I also agreed it's good to see it in practice. So I decided I'm going to be vulnerable. Kindra is going to talk to me about a story that I have around time and not having enough of it. And then we're going to take your questions for the last 15 or so minutes. So send those in as you think of them. We'll answer as many as we can, and take it from there. How does that sound, Kindra?
I love it. That sounds great.
Perfect. So I talked in the bio about some of the things that you've accomplished in your life, but I would love for you to share a little bit more about who you are. And in true storytelling fashion, is what are some of those invisible stories that you have overcome that have been most influential in your life?
Yeah, I guess I've learned throughout this process of writing this book that you write the book you yourself need the most. And as I was writing it, and even now, especially as it's out and I'm hearing from people and you do interviews and you get asked different questions and new stories emerge. But my expertise, my passion, all of my work has been in the power of storytelling, whether it's outward stories that we tell, stories in business to influence customers or to engage our teams. And now, of course, the very powerful stories of the stories we tell ourselves. And I think I've known for my entire life, my career, that there really are. Life is stories all around us. And when it comes to our internal stories, the ability to see them as such and stop that automation, and we can talk about that, stop the automation of the stories that are running in our brains, really unedited, unattended to, and start making choices for better stories. of course, is where I find myself now. And in the process of writing the book, I had to explore some of my own stories, and they're in all areas of life, right? Like, it isn't, the stories we tell ourselves aren't just centered around our work or our career or our relationships. So one of the stories I struggled with for a long time was, and it starts kind of as a belief. My belief was that I was bad at money. And that belief was supported by various stories, experiences, events in my life that led me to this belief. And the stories weren't untrue. Like, there was a time in my life when I was in graduate school and I took out student loans just to go shopping. Like, I was like, oh, I can take out a loan, and my education itself was really cheap, so I didn't need the loan so I used it for shoes. Like, it really was like, that was bad. There were times where I remember one time in particular where I went to the salon to get my hair done, and she sold me this shampoo that was, I should have asked how much it was, but I was embarrassed to, and I overdrew my bank account, right? So I had all these very specific examples in my life of being bad at money. And when you're constantly thinking about those, that you're bad at money in the back of your mind, you don't realize it's happening. It influences your financial decisions, and it affects your confidence. It affects everything around money. And so that was one of the stories that I really had to examine if I wanted to progress as a financially stable human being. But of course, then I have stories about being a mother. I have stories about my ability in my work. You mentioned time. I have stories all about time. I have stories about my athletic ability. We all have a variety of stories. And if we're not careful, they can define who we become.
Totally. So we're going to get into, I guess, the elements of what those look like. And you gave us a lot of good examples. But I guess to close out on that story that you shared about being bad at money, what was the story that you rewrote, that you hold now as your story around that?
And I think it's important to say here in this moment that it isn't change your story, change your life. Like, those things happened. I was on the phone yelling at Netflix back when they used to mail you DVDs saying, I canceled. Why did you send me these DVDs? Please don't charge me the $7 because I've already overdrawn my bank account. And so there are realities of that. However, in what I wanted to do for my life then, as I got married and was in a partnership and we were trying to build our family's financial future, there were also decisions that I made that may have sounded like I was bad at money, but they ended up being positive in that they were investments, right? Like, taking a leap of faith. I remember one instance where I said, hey, can we take a little bit of the money that we have in our savings and use it for a babysitter? Because I was a stay-at-home mom, but I wanted to start growing a business. I wanted to start doing research on storytelling. And that I couldn't do it because I was taking care of 2 kids. And so even though that sounds crazy, right? So I was really hesitant to say, can we take money from savings and use it for a babysitter? Because there I was, like, spending the money again, using that as evidence that maybe I also have a strength for investing in the things that can bring future reward and fortune. Because that decision to get a babysitter was one of the most important decisions financially I ever made, because that babysitter bought me the time to create what I have now. So seeing that as a tool anytime, because it can still haunt me, like, oh gosh, I don't know. Like, no, wait, I can also do good things with money.
Yeah. And the reframe that you're saying, the rewriting, which is not a one-time event, to your point, it's a continuous reminding yourself of maybe some of that default programming on the story about being bad about money, to continue reminding yourself consciously about investments and making choices about
Mhm.
investment and making decisions, like in the examples you gave.
Yeah.
So that's understandable in terms of the example. I think a lot of people can relate to that, and also starts to give a flavor for the types of stories that you're describing. And I want to go there next to kind of talk about what those elements are. You mentioned beliefs.
Yeah.
And so I think traditional stories that we think of have a beginning, a middle, and end, and there's an arc and characters. And I think that you're describing something different in terms of these invisible inner stories that are often beliefs or statements. I am statements, I am not,
Yeah.
I should. So tell us more about what the ingredients are of these types of stories that you're talking about in the book, in terms of invisible inner stories.
Yeah. So that is the key here is there are like what I really want people to walk away with is primarily awareness. Awareness of these invisible stories. And I call them invisible stories because they are. So let's take a step back here. Humans are storytelling creatures. This is how we make sense of the world. We tell stories to each other, and we have since the beginning of humankind to pass information down through generations, which is what allowed our species to thrive in the first place. However, we also at that same time developed an inner narrative where we were collecting events and experiences and cataloging them as evidence, as resources for who we are, what we should be doing, what's acceptable, what's allowed. And so when you ask about like the ingredients of a story, and like, what am I really talking about here? When we're talking about self stories, we're talking about actual events.
Mm-hmm.
Like I remember walking out of the salon carrying that bag of they were in pink bottles. Like I remember how it smelled, right? And I remember how guilty I felt walking out. Like, what am I going to do with the shampoo? I can't afford it. We remember, I mean, I bet I could say, Becky, do you remember like a elementary school bully or the most popular girl at your elementary school? Or like we remember, our brain catalogs these events, these experiences, and we don't pay any attention to them on our like conscious level because we don't have to. Our brain is doing that for us. So the stories we tell ourselves are as automated as the breath in our lung and the blood through our veins. And if we leave them unattended, there's another problem, and that is we have by nature a negativity bias. Right? Like these ancient brains are designed to keep us safe. So the events that they're collecting and cataloging are going to be events of your failures. They're going to be events of when things didn't go the way they planned, or when a comment came in from a colleague, or someone overlooked you at a meeting. They're because all of these experiences, events, stories are red flags for our brain to try to keep us safe. Stay safe. Don't step outside. Don't try to strive for something new. Just stay where you are. And, anytime you're in a position where you want to try something new or use your voice in a different way, there's a good chance your inner storyteller is flashing these red flags to keep you still. So, awareness, number one. And then number two, the agency and the action to then stop the automation and choose a story that serves you, that serves your goals, that serves where you want to be in life, so that you aren't just on this negative self-story ride, that you can take control of it and say, no, actually, we're going this way because over there is where I want to be. So I would say the big like ingredients are awareness, agency, like your ability to choose, and then
Mm-hmm.
ownership of the stories of where you've been and where you want to go.
Totally. And you bring up some really good points that I think are worth just making about the book being anchored in brain science. And what is a really cool mix of the book is why these stories hold you back, what do they look like, how to overcome them, but all of your strategies have built-in brain science behind them. And so it's not too heavy on that science, but it's really so applicable. And so what's really cool in the book, in part one, is we're wired for stories. That's what you talked about. Life imitates story, how your stories create your realities. Um, choosing your story and changing your life. And that's part one, like you becoming your stories. And then part two, just to give kind of a preview for these viewers, is catching yourself, analyzing, choosing, and then installing the rewiring and choosing those stories that serve you. And then the book could end there, but it doesn't. It goes into part three, which is really cool because it showcases a lot of examples of the stories in concrete ways from people around business and career, health and well-being, money and finances, relationships and love. And what's cool is you can observe how that unravels for other people in terms of that story and the iceberg moments that you refer to in the book, which are really clues, it sounds like, to really be able to see those and identify them. So for the viewers that we have today, in terms of seeing and identifying for themselves, what could you give us some examples? I don't know, 5 or 10 kind of examples of what some of those stories would be to start to jog some of their thinking. Of what that could be for them. What do they sound, look like, feel like?
So you mentioned it right there. There's a big part of the book in that so the middle part of the book is the method. And I know that anytime you put like change your life in the title of a book, that's like a bold promise, right? But I wanted to include a methodology, a pathway forward. This isn't just positive thinking and affirmations. This is a proven pathway for essentially rewriting and reworking the way that your brain works without any intervention. And so you mentioned the iceberg moments, and that's really where it starts. So, and I mentioned this, like we have these beliefs about ourselves. So picture an iceberg, right? And the tip of the iceberg is, it sticks out like a little mountaintop, but there's the waterline, and it wasn't the little mountaintop, the tip of the iceberg, that took down the Titanic. Like it was the fact that 90% of an iceberg's mass lives below the surface. And the same is true for us. 90% of what is taking us down or holding us back are the subconscious stories that are happening that we don't even know are there. So every once in a while, you'll get this, I call it an iceberg moment, where you will see one of these things pop above the surface, and they usually show up as a limiting belief. So these are like those limiting belief statements, like I'm bad with money, I'm a terrible parent. We did some research. We found that some of the top limiting beliefs were centered a lot around being enough or not being enough. So I'm not experienced enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not young enough. I'm not old enough. I'm not whatever it is. So we have these like belief statements. And this is where it typically becomes ineffective, because what we try to do is address that one belief. So if you're saying, well, I'm not enough, then you're going to write out like a series of affirmations that says, I am good enough, I am smart enough, I am whatever it is, without realizing that enough statement is just the tip. Beneath it are all of the stories of when you weren't enough, of when you didn't make the junior varsity team, of when you didn't, whatever it was, that are then supporting that belief. So if you only ever address that statement, you're completely ignoring the mass beneath it that is really what takes us out. And so and the process then of choosing better stories is, as that iceberg is crafted and filled with negative stories that our brain pays more attention to, there are also positive ones. So for example, I was working with a woman throughout the writing of this book, and I took a group of participants through the methodology as research. And it was a woman who was in a sales organization. She had big dreams for herself. And she started off doing really great. She was rising, getting a lot of recognition. And then she hit some sort of barrier. And all of a sudden the stories turned. or her belief was, well, I can't do this. I'm not good enough. I'm never going to be successful. I've never been successful. And as she went through the process, she had, stories from when she didn't make the dance team, stories of when she got left out for whatever it was. None of these stories were serving her. They weren't helping her take the action that was going to get her to the goal that she had. And so instead, we paused that automation and we consciously looked for times when she had been successful in this professional endeavor. And she remembered a weekend away that she was able to afford for her family, just at like a little cabin for her family, because of a bonus that she had received from this work that she was doing. She remembered being able to buy the Christmas toy that her son really wanted. And suddenly focusing on these smaller stories of her success and those moments of the recognition that she had received gave her, shifted the belief. And so that when she went to take the action that would lead her to future success, she used those stories to fuel it. So the stories can look like anything. And as you mentioned, Becky, the last part of the book is centered around 5 key areas of life, so that anywhere in your life where you're feeling stuck, you can take a look at those chapters and say, oh, okay, this is what that looks like. Here's where I need to start to analyze the stories that I'm telling myself.
Yeah, I think it makes a ton of sense. I think what you're describing is the iceberg, which is incredible, just the 10% and then 90% below. That there's a lot there in terms of one statement that might seem flippant or not, but the reality is there's a lot below the surface that all of us don't see. Everyone's going through different things that drives their behavior or their actions or their decisions. And so I appreciate the point that you made, that is, there's a lot of stories that are real and they're real things that happened. But there is a differentiator sometimes on your interpretation of them, and that your ability that you could find different evidence of your stories of your life to support other beliefs. And that's the choosing part in your title, is that you can choose something else and then find examples in your life that might be not as prominent, but they're there to support a different type of belief that you want to inherit about yourself, and have that evidence be to back it up.
Yep, exactly. So for example, I know a gentleman who kind of his operating system was, the world is out to get me and the people are out to get me, right? This is out to get me. And so it was circumstances out of his control. It was people in his office. It was his boss. It was the various governing they were all, and of course there were moments where they disagreed or something didn't go right. And it always came back to, people are out to get me. And there was a point at which, though, you can only get so far in life. And maybe, and this is where the ownership is really important. Maybe believing that the world is out to get you is serving you. Maybe that's helping you. Maybe your belief that everyone is out to get you is what gives you your fighting spirit, is what when somebody says no to you, you're like, hold on, no, don't say no to me. It could be, maybe it was the thing that got you to where you are. But for this person, there was a point in his career where that belief was problematic. And it was siphoning off joy. It was keeping him up. It was making him worse at his job. People just stopped liking him. He couldn't get anything done because nobody liked him, because he thought everybody was out to get him. Okay. And so there's this point then where, and I talk about this in the book, is this serving me? Well, it was no longer serving him. So now it's time to say, all right, let's pause that. Are there stories in my life where people were actually out to help me? And you know what? There were a lot of those stories too, great people on his team, and mentors who lifted him up. Even just the guy at the mechanic shop who was like, listen, usually they would charge you this much for this, but you know, like all of a sudden you can find all of these stories. And if knowing that his brain is going to play back to him all the stories of people being out to get him, he had to intentionally stop anytime those would come up and say, no, no, this person was there to support me. This person was there to support me. This person was there to support me. And how that changes everything. But again, it's all about choice. It's about, it requires discipline to stop and say, no, no, we've let that go. That isn't serving us anymore. Instead, we're going to choose these stories, and that's when the difference really can be made.
Totally. And I think the brain is always going to keep, I think sometimes our thoughts feel like our own, and it's really our brain's job, an expert as it is, to keep us safe. And to have those sorts of ideas and stories that then we have on repeat, to your point, and oftentimes negative. Like in the book, you talk about a couple different elements that is our brain's also ego, right, at play, and wired and job, sole purpose to keep us safe. And there's a lot of times it's like, thank you, but no thank you. I'm going to go do this. And it might feel uncomfortable, but I'm going to go try. I appreciate your concern, brain, for trying to keep me safe. But I'm going to go do this. It makes me uncomfortable to grow. But so it's constantly trying to parse those apart. Right. I think you talk about that in the book in terms of those self stories that often are stemming from ego versus the ones that we choose and write for ourselves.
And what a beautiful thing. I think it's a beautiful thing when you can separate the two and say, oh, you're so cute, and I appreciate your desire to protect me from threats. However, because there is so much, because I know, you mentioned, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but the story you tell yourself about time. And it's one thing to have the story that you're telling yourself and the belief that you have, and then to be somewhat aware of this belief, like, gosh, this is a terrible belief that I hold. And then you start beating yourself up about the belief that you have based on the stories that you tell yourself. And this approach and what you just mentioned there is, not only does it help us progress in a more productive way, but it also helps alleviate some of the guilt, shame, and beating up that we do. And like, oh, I see what you're trying to do. Okay. I'm going to do this instead of why do I always think this way? That just adds to the drama of it all.
Right, versus segmenting yourself from the brain, which that's the brain's job. And so it's not something that you need to feel shame or guilt about.
Right.
And it's not a one-time event, again, that you choose your story. It's continuing to choose it each day, hour sometimes, right, to remind yourself of that. And it won't be a set it and forget it rewriting event, but continuing to choose it each day, it sounds like.
Yeah, and you can think, there have been stories for me that I figured out that were pretty good. I had a story about exercise for a long time. I just never exercised in my entire life. I kind of got that figured out. I found an exercise that I loved, and that was a story that was put to rest until the pandemic, when my choice for exercise is group fitness, and that wasn't available to me. And I felt it was a whole chaos again. And my brain was like, haha, I told you, you weren't good at exercise. Like, you are not meant to, because it could see that I was
back.
So you just have to, I was like, oh wait, I see what's happening here. I need to double down on the stories that serve me.
Totally. So you talked about a lot of the steps in terms of the awareness and the agency and the rewriting. And I think now we're going to kind of put some of that into practice, right? To see some of those strategies that all of our viewers here can start to identify what that looks like for them and start to see some of these in play. How does that sound?
Yeah, I think that sounds great. Let's do it.
Cool. And as you have questions, please submit those. We'll start reading those in about 10 or 15 minutes. And I'll hand it over to you, Kindra, to say where to go from here to see this in practice.
So you meant, let's do it right here with you, Becky. You want to do that?
Yeah.
So you had mentioned that one of Well, why don't you tell us, what is one of your, as you've read the book, as you've been thinking about this, preparing for this, what is, and we haven't, like, this is not at all pre-scripted. Like, we are seriously doing
We're
this
very
right
live.
here, right now. Okay.
Yeah, very
So
live,
at
not
any moment we
pre-recorded.
might be
Yeah.
like, we're going through a tunnel. We have to abort the mission.
Nope.
But
Gonna be vulnerable.
what is one of your limiting beliefs? Like, what's a limiting belief that you hold that isn't serving you anymore?
The limiting belief is just around not having enough time.
Hmm.
And it could be in terms of small things, day to day responsibilities to get things done, and
Hmm.
also in the grander scheme of life. So it doesn't discriminate. It's just overall not having enough time.
When do you see yourself, like, when is that going through your head? Have you noticed times in the day where that is playing in your mind?
Every day. And like a calculation of time. And maybe that's partly human, right? We, of our roles at
Yeah.
work and in life and responsibilities and all of those things. So I think that's partly inherent,
Yeah.
is like kind of like that calculation of the puzzle that is the day to try
Hmm.
and do those things. But
Hmm.
it's constantly trying to like reconcile what can be done and by certain times. And that's where in a doing world, that's the reality of the situation, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, I know that I've, you are not alone in this belief. I struggle with this belief. There are a lot of people, especially in a doing world, that are struggling with this. And it is interesting how it can be a consistent state of being. Like, if you were to pause at any point during, like, when you get off this, when we're done with this interview, I bet you and I
Mhm.
both will pause, we'll get off, and we'll go like this. Oh my gosh, what do I have to do next? How am I ever going to fit all this in? Right. And in my work, I found that, like, at the beginning of the day, people waking up with this belief that, how am I going to get it all done? Or
Mm.
going to bed at night with this belief of, how am I don't have enough time. So one of the things you did a good job catching that limiting belief. And what I would recommend going forward, again, in the effort of awareness, is to just start paying attention to when it comes up. Is it in the morning? Is it in the
Mm.
evening? Is it, because it'll come up for me after, like, I'll do my workout, because now we can go back to group fitness, and I'll get out of the shower and I'll be drying off. And then all of a sudden it occurs to me again, oh my gosh, I don't have enough time. The reason I mentioned that, just as like kind of a hack, is because when we get to one of the later steps, the last step, which is install, we can be strategic about when we're telling
Mm.
ourselves our chosen stories. Um,
Love
okay,
that.
so we have this belief where I want you to think back across your entire scope of your life. What has your relationship with time looked like? Do you remember one of your earliest experiences with time, and, like, maybe it was a due date, or maybe it was getting something done, or do you remember any stories?
Yeah, I'm very biased towards timelines and sticking to them. And I think there's also a quality element
Mhm.
of doing things that I think might be some of the source of some of that pressure.
Mhm.
In terms, it's not about getting it done, check the box, right? It's
Mhm.
how it's getting done in terms of the quality and the thought and being strategic.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't have used that word as a high schooler, but I think to be sensitive to those deadlines and I guess respect them.
Yeah.
So for sure that is true today, of being respectful of timelines and deadlines and trying to ensure to be set up for success in terms of the quality of the work,
Mhm.
or the thought or
Mhm.
the time or the connection, right?
Mhm.
That it could
Mhm.
be a variety of different ways.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that anyone that I've talked to, that this is one of the challenges that they face, is time. It's not time in and of it. It's not like 60-second increments or 1 hour increments. There's more that goes into it. So as you
Sure.
just mentioned there, like the quality of the work. Would you ever say, Becky, that you struggle with perfectionism?
I'm recovering.
See? So that I asked
Yes.
that because that is usually where it's,
Yeah.
like, where you're like, "Oh,
Yeah,
I need
totally.
it to be perfect." And like I remember, um I remember an assignment for fourth grade that I actually handed it in late because I made it a lot bigger than it needed to be. And then there was a project in fifth grade where I did, and the teachers were understanding because I went over the top and it was such a big, but all of those were evidence of like, oh, you're bad with time. But they're also tied into, going, like putting myself, like having it be bigger than like, it
Sure,
isn't
expectations
acceptable.
of ourselves. Yep,
Exactly.
totally.
Exactly. So like looking back, so I would encourage you, and this is one thing that it's hard to do like right here on the spot, but go back and look at like, what are some of the things that those moments that would be reinforcing, like, because you don't have enough time because you need to make sure it's super quality work, and where you went just like more than you ever had to, that it was quality work, like killed yourself for the quality of your
Yep.
work. And so the next step then, once you have, so we have the limiting belief, we've caught some of the, we've caught that in the act. Now it's the question of analyzing it. Like, and the big question here, and in the book, I outlined 6 questions you can ask yourself. But the big question here is this serving you? Is this story of, I don't have enough time, is it serving you? Like, does it make you feel good? Or is it holding you back?
I think that on one hand, it's helpful to be a clarifier for being thoughtful about spending time. I'm a cancer survivor, and so that was a big
Yes.
event in my life that clarified how I want to spend my time. So while that's helpful, right, to have that perspective and to have gone through that experience as a clarifier, it also puts pressure
Yeah.
too, right? So if I'm being honest, I would say yes and no, to be honest with you.
Exactly. So it kind
Yeah.
of goes back to that example that I gave where the guy was like, everybody's out to get me. And for a while, that was really beneficial. I was actually just thinking about this morning, and the idea of time is when you have an event in your life where you recognize the limited amount of time that we have.
Sure.
Cancer survivor. There's a woman that I acquaintance with that just passed away, just unexpectedly at 28 years old. And, if you're a really close friend of that young woman, it might be a completely different reframing of having enough time. And so in your case here, it's like, okay, it's serving me, but at what point is it becoming a detriment? Is it stealing
Exactly.
away the enjoyment that I want to feel in my life? And so right there, that's the opportunity then to say, okay, that piece I love, that I am conscientious of time, that I know that time matters. What I don't love, what isn't serving me is that like the weight on my shoulders of time. And so then the next step is to choose. So that's the problem we want to solve for, is to choose stories that help alleviate that pain. And so one thing that I would recommend for stories for you to think about is stories when you almost had the ability to create time, where you were doing so many things that everybody else would say it was impossible, but they were things that you cared about. They were things you were passionate about. And for whatever reason, you were in that flow, and you were able to expand time. Because telling
What a
yourself
gift. Yeah.
those stories will remind you, no, I create as much time as I need. Like, time comes to me. Maybe another, since this is tied into the quality of your work and everything, maybe a story of the time where you turned something in, whether it was an assignment or maybe it was a project or whatever, and you just handed it in, and it was excellent, and it was more than they could have wanted without you, like just your natural ability. For example, I was beating myself up about writing this book because I didn't spend enough time writing it. I wrote for 6 weeks straight, and I finished a book in 6 weeks. Now, I'd been thinking about it. I did
Sure.
research for much longer than that, right? But I was like, this isn't. And so now that is a story for me that I tell myself, I can write an excellent book in 6 weeks of typing. And so I can use that now. So those are just a
Mm.
few places that I would recommend that you look. The other thing you can do is look outside yourself for examples and stories in the people around you who you admire and respect, and the way that they experience their time, or lessons that you can learn. For example, my son, 5th grade, I picked him up from school a couple weeks ago, and he was like, well, it was kind of an emotional day. And I was like, okay, why? And he said, they gave us so much homework, and I just got very upset. And I started to cry at school. He's very emotionally intelligent. I love this kid. He said, because I just don't know how I'm going to get it all done. I don't have enough time. And I recognize in that moment, I'm like, oh, I feel like there might be a story here that I can use for myself, right?
Mm.
And so I said, well, but now I'm a mother, and he's my son, and I know that he has enough time. I know how much time he has before it's time to take a shower and go to bed. I said, well, let's just get home and see what happens. And so he finished his sheets of math homework. He did his reading. He did his writing, and he had 2 hours to spare. It was more the thought of the work that triggered his brain to say, you don't have enough time for this. And so then I saw that as a story that I could retell myself. I'm sure, Becky, these stories you're seeing, I can retell myself when I'm like, I don't have enough time. And I'm like, oh, remember that night that your son thought he didn't have enough time, and he just couldn't see it the way that you could. I just can't see the time that I have from an outsider's perspective. So there are a few of the different strategies for choosing a better story. And then lastly, I mentioned this at the beginning, the last step is to install these stories. So if you can figure out different times in the day, maybe when this idea of time and it not serving you is bringing you down, those chosen stories that you've identified, tell yourself that story when you wake up in the morning. Tell yourself that story when you finish this meeting and have to jump right into the next one and say, no, remember that time where I had a full day and I just crushed the whole thing? I have all the time I need. Because again, it's all about how you feel about these stories you're telling yourself. And if you tell yourself that story before you go into the next meeting, you're going to perform so much better. You'll be so much more effective in that next meeting than, oh my gosh, I've just got to get through this meeting and then on to the next thing and on to the next thing. But then be very intentional about replaying. And anytime you feel that, like the negative side of time, not the positive one, retell yourself those stories. Oh, that was clearly, I feel very strongly about this, Becky. I don't ever do this like real time like that. But was that helpful?
Super helpful. I want to recap you gave me so many ideas, and I want to recap that for everybody because it doesn't happen in 10 minutes, right? But you've given us so much to think about that I want to recap it. I'm going to plug here just to enter your questions. We're going to go there in a few minutes to answer your questions. But Kindra, super helpful. The things that I took away in terms of a lot of ideas, tactics, strategies, where to like audit your thoughts. Some of the clues are the I statements, I am statements, I am not statements, to start to get clued into what some of those invisible stories are, to create more awareness around them for yourselves. I love your point of like, when do those continue to pop up? Is in the morning when you wake up and you're looking at your calendar to see back-to-back meetings, for example? Is that when it pops up? Is there other times? Because then you complement that with, those are the times to utilize another story to intercept. And I love that word, intercept, the event in your response. You talk about that in the book, to kind of intercept that occurrence. To think about the stories that reinforce beliefs. So you're asking about examples in my life that have reinforced the belief around time, and that's true for other people too. If you think about stories, that is the evidence that you utilize, whether you have to think about it for a minute or if they're off the top of your head, right? Stories that you can think of. Also buttons, when you're triggered, buttons are our own. And so those are often clues that made me think of it, that is pressing on a belief, right? You talked about what stories do serve or don't, or what elements do. So I think those are helpful strategies as well, in terms of being aware of, you asked me about like, how does it serve you? And it's like, but it does and it doesn't, but being able to parse out, right? the helpful parts about it and
Yeah.
the not so helpful parts about it. And then you talked about kids, and it's been said that kids hold a mirror to us for the lessons that we still have to learn about
Mm,
ourselves. And
yeah.
so I think that's super helpful as they hold a mirror, because they're also seeing us in action, and we can learn things about ourselves for things that they go through. But also for many of us as parents here today is just being able to clue into some of those statements, those iceberg moments, to be a parent to them and to clue into what those statements are. And there's probably a lot going on in their head that they're not always able to communicate.
Oh, yeah.
And the last thing, it's a lot of talking for me too, but you recap so much. I just want to reinforce for
Yeah.
everybody listening, all the strategies that you shared with us today is this idea of like celebrating the end of the day, the end of a project, the end. And I think we're always just fast forwarding to the next.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel like finished or the end of a chapter. And so it just keeps sailing.
Yeah.
And so creating some space, even if it's 1 minute or 10 seconds, to kind
Yeah.
of like validate it before just letting it move by. It seems like that's another helpful strategy,
Yeah.
like active learning, essentially, right?
Yeah, like if you never, and I think this is, and for anyone who's watching this, you're obviously an achiever. That's why you're here. That's why you participate in these talks. And one of the problems, one of the challenges that achievers face is we're always achieving. We're looking at the next thing.
Yep.
But in doing so, then we fail to recognize when something has just happened that is worthy of capturing as a story and using in the future when we need it. And so, yeah, even a pause between meetings to pause and say, hey, wow, that was really great. The story I can use of a time where my day was really busy and I was excellent at all of it. Like I was on top of time and time wasn't burying me. And B, to retell yourself those positive stories yet before going into the next thing, if that's the limiting belief that you're struggling with.
Totally. Thank you so much for taking me through that process. I really appreciate it. And
You have to keep me updated on
I
what
will keep you
happens.
updated. I will let you know.
Yeah.
And hopefully for our viewers, that was helpful for you to see those steps. That what's cool about the book is it's very process focused in terms of the steps, and very actionable. But also there's thought that goes into it and reflection. It's not always about doing. And so it's a cool mix of that. So we are going to move to some questions. We can have the first question come up. I will read it and we'll get through as many as we can. All right. So the first question is, do you have a process to keep track of your own life stories as they happen? Otherwise, it seems difficult to remember all the relevant details, especially as they might turn out to be important later.
Yeah. I love this question, Armin. And I think that there's a few, in terms of a process, I wish I had a process. I will tell you what my process is. Texting myself, writing things on Post-its. I have like 5 different notebooks that I write down little stories in. Like I email, like, oh, this happened. Remember this story. It's kind of a mess. What I will say, I think you're absolutely right. One of the big challenges is that we don't see things as stories first and foremost. So when a good thing happens to us, unless you've been through this process, you're not saying, ooh, that is a story I will use later. So now, again, in the spirit of awareness, my hope is that just knowing that these stories can be retold to yourself as a powerful tool for moving forward will make you more aware of them. But it's true. It does require discipline. So I would recommend, and I know people groan when I say this, but journaling is a really great way. Like at the end of the day, to write down any of the, and I'm even just thinking a story I need to write down that happened yesterday that I didn't write down yesterday, but like any of the things that happened that could be good stories for you to use later on. If you're trying to recall stories, again, now that you know, and hopefully you'll have a better inclination of, ooh, there's a story there. Oh, I can use that as a deeper or different understanding of myself. conversations with old friends is a great way to be reminded of stories, or family members. Looking through photo albums will inspire maybe different stories or memories that you've had, that not just for the experience itself, but for the greater lesson that is embedded within it. Those are, and then the other thing I would say, and this is kind of counterintuitive, but a lot of people, you hear about social media being a highlight reel, right? And it's kind of like the downside of social media, because you're just looking at everybody else's highlight reel and you're thinking that your life isn't nearly as good as everybody else's. However, and fine, that's all fine and true, but then go back and look at your own social media, because the things that you've been posting are likely the great stories, the good memories, the moments of kindness. So I use my own Instagram as inspiration to remember the great stories that, our brain is like, okay, enough. We don't need to spend energy on those. Let's spend energies on these other ones that will prevent you from threat. So there are a few strategies, but it's messy. I think the most important thing is now being aware of it. Hopefully you'll see those stories a little bit more clearly as they happen and as you remember them.
Totally. Yeah, it is a lot of different stories all over, but to have a system, like I always have a Google Doc as a journal, or my notes app, or things like that, because it's cool to go back and read them over time.
Well, that's why I have all these folders in my Gmail of like stories about this, and stories about this, and stories about this. And I someday I will sit down and go through all of those emails. I will say though, if you're doing that, make sure to put enough information in it that you're like, because I'll look and be like, what was I even talking about in this moment? So give yourself enough of a description that you'll be able to recall the story when you look for it later on.
Good tip.
Yeah.
Love that. Thank you, Armin, for the question. All right. So the next question that we have is from Bayard Russell. I fear making life changes that lead to a loss of the gifts I have now and feeling regret. How do you recommend dealing with this type of story? Great question. And Kindra, you talked about regret with Mel Robbins, and you had this incredible insight. So hopefully you share that as part of your answer here for Bayard.
Yeah, I think that was another, when we did our research to see like what are the big, I think the question, or one of the questions was, if there was one thing you could change, like one thought that you have that is keeping you from where you want to be, what would it be? And the fear of regret came up a lot, or the fear of regret and kind of as a subsidiary, like managing previous regrets. And so I think that is, it's a beautiful thing to recognize what you have, and that losing it would be sad. I mean, I think we don't do a lot of that. Like, wow, I actually love what I have. I would be sad if I lost what it is that I have. But here's what I would say about regret. And, call me an optimist, but I think the most, and I've used this in my own life, I've seen people use this in their life, is that if ever you are concerned about regret, or you're feeling regret, it simply means that it is the middle of the story. And so if you are, like, our family made a really big decision to leave a beautiful life that we had. We lived in Arizona, just this gorgeous, sprawling suburban life. And we were contemplating a move to New York City just because it felt like the right thing to do. And there was so much in that decision making, because we would be leaving a beautiful thing behind. But you have that thought of like, what is possible? And ultimately, we came to a storytelling conclusion, which is, if we go and we regret, then that is just the middle of the story. And we'll go all the way through that experience until we get to a point in the story where it's no longer regret. You're on the other side of the middle.
Yeah, it's so poignant as a clarifier. And it's a great question that I think is probably on other people's minds, and also to your point of decision making in the future, and how to use that as a clarifier of how we're going to spend our time to avoid if possible. Regret that will happen though.
I mean, things go wrong. Things don't turn out like
Totally.
best case scenario. There's middle case scenario, right? And it's when you get too wrapped up in that, or to just suspend it and be like, wow, this is the middle of a story, isn't
Mhm.
it? Like that is, let's see how this bad boy turns out. I feel like it's a much more palatable way to manage regret.
Totally.
Mhm.
Yeah. All right. So we are we have a few minutes left. So Kendra, we've covered so much today. We've talked a lot about the awareness, how to identify the stories, what's underneath the iceberg and the 90%, how to rewrite. We've talked about so much today. What did we not cover that's important for you to share, or final thoughts that you have for
You know,
today?
I think actually, and this may, or well, no, it can be for anyone. But we talked briefly about family and kids
Hmm.
and stories, and whether you're a parent or whether you're a role model in somebody's life, or even just a team leader. um, you have, now that we've been here together, you will not only start to witness your own stories, but having this knowledge, you'll start to see other people's stories and the things that they believe about themselves. And it's
Hmm.
you have an opportunity then to, when something good happens in someone's life, like let's say it's a young woman on your team and she was really nervous because it was a big event, or there was a big project and she really worked at it, and you know that because she's an achiever, she's going to forget about all the struggle that she went through,
Hmm.
all of the challenge, all of the hard work, and of how it all paid off, and that she is enough, and that she has what it takes, and that she um to to start to see these experiences for the people around you, grab onto them and
Hmm.
tell those stories back to them. We talk about how resilient kids are, and especially throughout the course of the past 2 years. And it'd be really easy to say to them at some point, like, "Oh, kid, you were so resilient. You were so resilient." But it would be so much better to remember that one day when everything happened and they had to come home and like go through second grade through a computer screen, and
Hmm.
like tell those stories back to them, because there's going to be a day in their future when they're 20, when they're 35, where everything gets turned upside down. Hopefully not in the way that it has here, but on individual levels that happens. And then as a parent or as a role model, to say, but do you remember that time when this happened and everything was, you've done hard things before. This
Hmm.
is who you are, and tell that story forward. It is the greatest gift you can give anyone, is telling their stories back to them.
It's a great point, because we're talking about the inner stories and our work for ourselves to identify what that is, especially as we embark on this new year, but also a really important reminder of the other people in our lives, and to be able to see and remember those stories and remind the other people in our life, whether it's our friends, our family, or people on our team, about the other stories and the evidence that they see, because it's so easy to forget, especially as our brain is scanning for something else.
Yep.
It kind of lets that go, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So it's a life skill in that
Yep.
way.
Exactly. And you get to be the person to like create and give that back to them, so they have that story as front of their minds instead of below
Yeah.
the surface.
What a gift, right?
Hmm.
Well, this book is a gift. Choose Your Story, Change Your Life. It's out now, and any seller that is your favorite to buy books. You can get a signed nameplate by Kindra at Choose Your Story, Change Your Life. You can follow her at Kindra Hall on Instagram. It was such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for this gift, all the strategy you share with us today. And hopefully we will see you soon.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to share, Becky. And I can't wait to hear what stories you tell yourself.
All right. I will keep you posted. All right. Thanks everyone for listening, and be well. Take care.